If you build it, they will come. I know you might have seen the baseball movie with Kevin Costner and the White Sox and all that stuff. And I was kind of thinking about that. But If You Build It, They Will Come is about commerce. And it's about commerce in early America in this period that comes after the American Revolution. So we go back a little bit, but it encompasses a lot of this period we just talked about in the era of good feeling. So the very late 18th century and the early 19th century, really this whole period that goes, into the 1830s and 40s is this period we're getting at right now. And so very simply, I want you to understand what the definition of commerce is. Now, I know you're going to have to take an economics class if you haven't already, and I'm sorry, it'll be boring. Kind of like you have to take a government class and it'll be boring. And yet you learn all the important stuff in your history class. So the same is true here about commerce. So very simply, and this is my definition of how commerce works, commerce is nothing more than moving stuff from where it's made to where it's needed. It doesn't matter what stuff we're talking about, and it doesn't matter how it gets moved. Those things change over time, right? But the process of doing that is commerce, moving stuff from where it's made to where it's needed. And one of the challenges that the United States is running into is it is growing, and it is growing fast, and it is already bigger than practically every other country in the world. This map on the screen just shows the population movement over 10 years, from 1810 to 1820. That will accelerate and get denser on the east, but it will spread farther west, right? And the more population grows and the denser it gets in some places, we need to be moving goods and services, food, whatever we're talking about, has to be moved around so that people can have access to it. And if you live out west in this early period of time, you're kind of living out on your own, right? Abraham Lincoln grew up, was born, 1819 or something like that, somewhere in that range. And he was born in Illinois in a log cabin and all that. And they'll talk a little bit about him in one of your documentaries. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're living completely off the grid, completely cut off from everybody until this transportation revolution happens. And that has to do with commerce, right? And so it becomes more and more important to have better modes of commerce, better modes to move stuff around than we had in the past. So that continues to evolve. So today we have the internet. I know the internet moves data, but it then allows for other things to happen too. But things like, we're going to talk about roads and steamboats, canals. The next phase after that is railroads, which we'll talk about in another lecture. And then of course you get roads, like paved roads for cars and trucks, and then you get airplanes, that sort of thing. And now the internet, right? They had the Pony Express and the mail and the internet, and it's about moving stuff. Okay. And so America, because it's so large, even now here in the early 19th century, has to address that situation. So first we'll talk about roads. Roads are important. There will be more miles of roads than anything else, but they will be sort of the least useful over the long distance. They're made of dirt, they're made of mud, although here you see some guys building a newer style of road in the 1820s where you can see they're laying some road base and they're smoothing it out. They're not paving it yet. That's not till way later. But even then, these roads are super expensive, and when the weather's bad, these roads are not very good, right? When a dirt road gets rained on, it just turns into mud. And if you have a wagon, you can't use it. And so roads are only as good as the road itself is and as the weather is. They're super expensive to build. Plus in this picture, you see a lot of guys kind of sitting around, maybe doing nothing while a couple guys are working. So I guess road maintenance and road building hasn't changed much in the last couple hundred years. They also don't have, of course, the use of machinery to move earth on the scale that we can now. They didn't have dynamite. Everything was done by hand, pick and shovel, gunpowder maybe, things like that. They do experiment with private roads on the East Coast called turnpikes. Today, here in Texas, we just call them toll roads, but it's the same idea. But back in the day, they didn't really help a lot. And you're going to see, to some degree, local businesses and governments start taxing or paying taxes in order to build roads, because you realize that if you have a good road connecting point A and point B, that's going to increase commerce. And if you increase commerce, guess what else you increase? Taxes. So governments start to figure out that it's good to have good roads. And so first it'll be local cities. Boston needs to make sure it's connected out to the countryside. And so they'll start developing roads internally and then externally. And then pretty soon Massachusetts will realize that the more that the state is put together by roads, the better commerce will be. And then pretty soon the federal government starts to jump on board. But those are things that are going to take decades and decades and decades. And as we mentioned in another lecture, at the federal level, it's nearly impossible to get funding for something like this, because no state's going to vote to raise taxes to put this money in another state. And the southern states don't generally believe in building roads and things like that anyway, because they don't need them, at least as far as they think. So roads are important, but they're the least useful over a long distance. So for example, if you live in western Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, let's say, and you're 300 miles away from Philadelphia, which would then get you to New York and these other places, you're basically not going to do that. You could make the trip, you can walk, but you're not going to be able to haul a super heavy wagon over the mountains for 300 miles and then expect that you'll have anything left to sell. And so again, if you live in western Pennsylvania, you're largely on your own in terms of going west. Now, as we'll see in a bit, you can go down the Mississippi River. So roads are good. Roads are important. Roads are always going to be there. But they're the least important, the least useful. Well, then you get to the steamboats. All right. And Robert Fulton gets credit for inventing the American steamboat. The steam engine is a British invention, as a lot of these things are at the time. And he's going to take that concept of a steam engine, which was developed to build pumps, and then later to build little steam engines to haul ore out of mines. And then now we're going to use it to navigate these rivers we have in the middle part of America, right? The area we call the Midwest now is just full of all these big, wide rivers that come, and they almost all come and meet in the Mississippi, and they go all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And so this kind of boat that you see in the picture is perfectly designed for those kinds of wide, slow, shallowish rivers. And this allows huge amounts of freight to then move downriver. But the magic here, and what transforms everything, is that these boats can go upriver. So when you watch the documentary, and I sometimes get them confused, this might have already happened in a previous documentary, in a previous section, but they're going to show, Abe Lincoln building a raft and loading their cargo on it and sort of pulling their way down the river, and their goal was to get to St. Louis or New Orleans, and then they'll sell all their goods. But the problem was they would have to walk back, and that meant that while they could sell everything down there, they couldn't take very much back with them. They certainly weren't going to haul a wagon the 800 miles that it took to walk back. So this wasn't like a trip these guys made every year. It'd be once every 2 or 3 years, and then they would bring money and a very small amount of stuff that they could bring back. Maybe they buy a couple animals, but again, very little. Well, the steamboat now, being able to go upriver because it's powered, allows you to haul freight upriver. So if you were born in a log cabin in Illinois, now you can order whatever you want from New York City, a steel plow, for example. Because let's say Lincoln saw a steel plow when he was in New Orleans, and he thought, man, that thing would be great, but there's no way I'm going to get a steel plow up there. But now that a steamboat can steam all the way up the river, he can have access to that. So what happens is prices plummet and availability goes up, right? We're able to produce more stuff, but commerce then allows us to move more of that stuff to places where it's needed, where there's a demand. And because of that, because it costs less to ship stuff, the prices of those things are going to go down. So Lincoln can order a steel plow, have it shipped nearby, and you can haul it 50 miles. You can't haul it 800 miles, right? So now everyone who lives in the Midwest is going to have access to basically the same stuff that everyone on the East Coast has access to. This then facilitates people moving west. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. The easier things are to get in the West, the more people are willing to move to the West because it's more like home. It's more convenient. And the more money you make, the more stuff you can buy, the more is available. That means your standard of living is going up. And that's what the name of the game is in America. So we talked about the era of good feelings in the last lecture. Part of that goes to the economy is booming and it is blowing up, and Americans are getting wealthier than they've ever gotten before. And of course, there are still some exceptions to that. This is certainly not a perfect system. Now, the great thing about these boats, again, is they can go both up and down river. So huge amounts of freight are going to now be transferred up and down the Mississippi. But remember, it's still a long, circuitous route from Illinois down to New Orleans, loaded onto a regular ship, because these steamboats can't go in the ocean. They're for wide rivers, as it says, and calm water, maybe lakes, small lakes. And then a real ship sails to New York, and then it brings the stuff back, and then it gets loaded onto steamships and then sent back up the river. So this is how that process begins. It still takes weeks to accomplish. So even now, it's easier to go from Pittsburgh to go down the river and around Florida and over to New York than it is to go straight across. You just can't really do that on a commercial way. You could travel that way, but you can't really do it on a commercial way. So steamboats are a huge fundamental change. They're going to change the way the Midwest lives. And they're going to allow the Midwest then to grow into what we know of today as a big industrial area, because now you can get in iron and steel and different other things. The third piece of this puzzle, road steamboats, the third piece is canals. We're going to focus on the Erie Canal, which again will be highlighted in one of your documentary videos. But the Erie Canal is a canal that gets built across the whole state of New York. You can see a map here on the left side. The canal starts in Buffalo, New York on Lake Erie. That's why it's called the Erie Canal. And it goes through New York, and it goes to Albany, which is on the Hudson River. And then of course, the Hudson River then is connected to New York City. All right. So basically, this canal is connecting all of New York together to New York City. And most people, know there's a New York State, but we always just think in terms of the city. So there's this whole state out there that has farms and cows and all this stuff, and they're trying to get it to New York. That's where most of the people live, and of course that's the outlet to get it to and from other countries. Now, what this does, you can see they also built some other canals. That's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These other little canals that stemmed off of it. But the Erie Canal is the main thing. It connects Lake Erie to New York City. But really, it connects the entire region. So that part of Canada, Lake Ontario, you can see it's connected to Syracuse eventually. Anything that can get onto Lake Erie or Lake Ontario is now directly connected to New York City. And it works both ways. So much like the steamboat going up and down the Mississippi, this canal goes back and forth across the state of New York. Now, people thought this was a crazy idea. DeWitt Clinton is the governor of New York. They called it Clinton's Big Ditch, because that's really what this is. It's a big ditch. You can kind of see a drawing of it on the right there. They called it Clinton's Folly. They thought he would ruin his career. I think he's governor of New York for like 20 years. And it made New York a fortune, and it made New York the richest state in the country. And because it connects everything into the city in a very direct way. Now, they just had to build this from scratch. They just dug it up. They also had to go through a mountain, so they had to build locks, that let them go up and down. And you can see there's a couple of mules there, and it kind of looks weird in the picture. Those two mules are pulling the boat in the background, and the two mules in the background are pulling the little barge in the foreground. So your job would be just to walk along the road next to the canal, and you'd be tugging this barge, and you can haul far more freight on a barge than you can on a wagon. And then you would walk for about 15 miles or 20 miles, and then you would stop, you would park the barge, you would park the animals, you would rest, and then you would get up and walk another leg, or maybe you cross over and walk back and tow a barge. And so that way all this freight is moving back and forth across the Erie Canal. Now, this was built in the early 1800s, in the teens, and it's still in use today 200 years later. Of course, it's been rebuilt, revamped, and enlarged, but it's still in use, and it's still a huge way that freight is moved across this part of the country, really this part of North America. And it's very, very ingenious. And also, you see all these little towns that are along the way. And I think in the film, they'll tell you that like 80% or some number of the population of New York State that doesn't live in New York City lives somewhere along the Erie Canal. So all these little towns develop because about every 15 or 20 miles, they would have to have a place for these workers to stop and sleep. And that will develop these communities. Very much like in Texas, where there's railroads, there would be a town about every 20, 30 miles because the locomotives would have to stop and get more water and get more fuel and things like that. So these little towns develop just to service those things. Same thing happens here. So this is going to start a canal boom in America, although this is the most famous and probably the most profitable of the canals that we see. So that's the commerce side. That's the moving side. This second half of the lecture is going to talk about some of the stuff. Not the details or particulars of the stuff, but kind of the big concepts here. And so one side of this is factories. We got to be able to make stuff, right? And the reality is these factories are going to be almost exclusively in the northern states. There's going to be a big difference between northern states and southern states. Almost all your factories are going to be in the northern states. And they'll start in Rhode Island and they'll start in Massachusetts, but they will eventually be built in all of these big, highly populated cities and areas around these big cities. So Samuel Slater, for example, is someone who understood how these things worked. A lot of British immigrants are going to come here and they're going to take the know-how that they have borrowed from Britain. And Britain sort of hoards this information because this is how Britain makes a lot of money. These factories, the British are already doing these kinds of things. Even during the American Revolution, there are factories in Britain turning out cloth and things like that. So Samuel Slater moves to Rhode Island and he builds a thread factory. So each one of these is a layer to the whole process. You have what's called cottage industry, where if I'm a store owner in New York, I'm going to buy wool from a farmer, from a sheep herder, right? Or cotton, as the case may be. And I'm going to take that, and then I'm going to go to a bunch of individuals who know how to spin that into thread, and I'm going to pay those people by the pound. And then I'm going to take the finished thread, I'm going to go to another group of people who are experts at weaving that thread or yarn into cloth. And I'm going to pay them by the yard of cloth they produce for me. And then I'm going to take the cloth and I'm going to take it to another group of people who are experts at cutting that up and sewing it into dresses or shirts or frock coats, whatever the case may be. And then I'm going to pay them by the piece. And then I'm going to sell those things in my store. That's called cottage industry. Well, these factories start cutting out pieces of that. So Slater's thread factory kind of does away with the need to have people spinning thread in their home. It makes the process more efficient. It makes the product better, but it does make people lose income. A lot of those people will end up going to work in these factories. Well, Francis Lowell and a guy named Waltham then a few years later in the early 1800s create a power loom factory, and you see a drawing of that here in this picture. This is of a Lowell factory, and these are machines that turn thread into cloth. It's basically a super dumb computer, as they'll talk about in one of these videos. But you're going to have these women. The Waltham Lowell system was to hire all these women because women were cheap. Sorry, ladies, but it's a supply and demand issue. Here's a second economic truth. If there's a high demand for something and a small supply, it will be expensive. If there's a very low demand for something and there's a huge supply, then they will be cheap. And at this point, not too many women are working in these kinds of situations. Again, remember, this is very, very early on in this situation. So there's all these women available to do all this work. Plus, I think there's a gender thing where it was assumed that women would be better at maybe operating these machines anyway. And they tended to be the ones who were doing it in the cottage industry because the men tended to be the ones out doing the farming part and the women were at home doing the other parts. Again, that's a general rule. So anyway, they'd hire all these women. The wages would be low. These women would move into these dormitories and they would get paid, and then they would pay room and board. And then inevitably business turns down or there's more competition. These women are actually going to go on strike and actually succeed. So some of the first people that go on strike in America are women. And so basically what we're getting at here is we're going to borrow all this technology from the British and who else, but we're going to make it our own. We're going to adapt it to the needs that we have. All right. We're going to build factories in a way that are going to make huge amounts of money in a very American way. So they're going to be steam powered at first, water powered, later on, of course, diesel powered and electricity powered and things like that, right? Well, that technology will change. But the basic idea is we'll take these machines where we borrow the technology from the British and we'll do it in a very American way, and we'll pay these wages. And eventually women working will kind of give way to immigrants, because immigrants are even cheaper, because every decade there are more and more and more immigrants coming to America at this point in time from Ireland and Scotland and England still. As you get into the mid 1800s and late 1800s, it's Russians and Poles and Germans and others. They're all going to be flooding into this country, and they're going to end up working mainly in these factories. And that's one of the reasons why wages will be pretty low. And eventually, and this is an issue for History 1302 class, things will have to be done to try to fix some of these problems. But at this point, this is very new technology. The point is they're making more stuff, they're making better stuff, they're making it faster, and in the end it gets cheaper. And when you combine that with being able to move stuff anywhere we want, well then this creates a consumer boom in America. Now, just for some perspective on how big these factories become, in 1861, when the Civil War begins, right? There are more machines in this one little town of Lowell, Massachusetts making cloth than there are in the entire Confederacy. So it's no wonder that the Confederate Army tends to be low on supplies. They just don't have factories. 3% of all firearms are made in the South when the war begins. All of them are made in the North. So that's why this is such a big difference. These are northern things. Now, when you turn to the South, you got to talk about cotton. We talked about tobacco in previous lectures. Cotton's sort of the next big thing that comes after tobacco. It's huge, so much that they call it King Cotton. You can see this guy sort of bowing to cotton and worshiping King Cotton here, right? Cotton becomes the moneymaker. It is a gigantic cash crop that will grow everywhere. The problem is it's hard to deal with, all right? But once that is overcome, and we'll look at that in a minute, cotton is going to be grown everywhere in America, and these plantations in particular, where they already have slave labor, remember, are going to increase in the number of slaves they have. The slaves are going to increase in value and so on. So there was a huge demand in the world for cotton, both from Europe and from these northern factories. You got to keep that in mind. The northern factories are demanding gigantic amounts of cotton. And so we'll get to this later, but as some northerners are starting to say slavery is bad and evil, there's still an economic connection to it that they may not even be thinking about. And that is the very factories they're working for are getting cotton from southern plantations that are using slavery, right? But there's this huge demand for it, and that'll play into the war also. So again, perspective here. The United States by 1861 supplies nearly 3/4 of the entire world's cotton supply. That's how much cotton America is producing. Almost 75% of all of it is coming from America. Can you begin to understand why it is so valuable? Why they call it King Cotton? Can you begin to understand why Southerners, slave owners in particular, do not want to let slavery go? Why they're paranoid? Why they're afraid that slavery will be done away with? Remember, we talked about balance, about 12 free states and 12 slave states. Well, that number will continue to increase, but they'll always maintain a balance. They are afraid that slavery will be done away with, and in doing so, they will do away with this huge industry. Well, the reality is, don't forget, cotton's also tied to the North. So just because northern states are slave free doesn't necessarily mean everyone wants to do away with slavery. It's really not until the 1850s, and of course during the Civil War, where that really becomes a major issue in the North. So earlier we had said something about, I think in the previous lecture, about that some people say this war, the Civil War, was not about slavery. You can make an argument that from the Northern perspective, it was not at all about slavery, at least at first. But from the Southern perspective, it is all and almost entirely about protecting slavery. But again, we'll get to that as we go forward. Now, what changes the dynamic is Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which is, you have a picture of a very basic one here. And the problem with cotton in America was it was super easy to grow. It was difficult to pick, but remember they had all this slave labor, but you couldn't pick the seeds out of it fast enough to be profitable. In other words, it took a person, a slave, a whole day to pull the seeds out of a pound or two of cotton. But this machine that Eli Whitney invented allows them to do that in a few minutes. And so all of a sudden, the bottleneck, which is pulling the seeds out of the cotton, is blown open. And so now America can go on and become, as we saw, the largest cotton producing country in the world ever. And so the cotton gin does away with that. So the cotton boom happens after the cotton gin, which is short for cotton engine, is invented. And of course, that's going to have a monumentally huge impact, and a negative one, on slavery. And so we'll spend a few minutes here talking about slavery. We'll hit it again going forward. But after the Revolution, the truth is there were many of the founding fathers felt like slavery was going to go away naturally. And in fact, it does go away in other countries. In the 1830s, the British do away with slavery. This makes the American slave owners that much more paranoid and more afraid about losing their slaves. So the world picture has to play into why southern states left the Union to protect slavery, because they saw it coming. They saw that everyone else was doing away with it, and they didn't want to. So that's, again, a piece of the pie here. A lot of people thought slavery would go away. A lot of people started setting their slaves free, even in Virginia, sort of bastions of the old world slavery. Slaves were starting to be set free. Slaves had some ability to purchase their own freedom and so on. But the cotton boom's going to basically erase all that. It's going to change the tune, because cotton suddenly becomes so valuable that people, unfortunately and sadly, refuse then to let their slaves go. And so they justify slavery even more. Prices of slaves go way up. People become millionaires based on the fact that they own a couple thousand slaves rather than the fact of anything they're producing. Slaves will be sold by people in the Old South to the New South. You see on our map how the states are spreading west, and slavery also is spreading west. So there's a whole lot of slaves, let's say, in Virginia and North and South Carolina. But there's not a whole lot of slaves in Missouri and Alabama and so on. So they'll be selling slaves. They call it being sold down the river. They'll be auctioning them off. It's a horrific, horrible situation. It's very much like cattle. And I know that might sound offensive, and I'm sorry, but that's what it was. And it was awful. And it should be offensive. But that's what it was. And people were treated like animals, but on the other hand, they were also treated like animals in the sense that they were valuable. And so there are all sorts of relationships that happen within the guidelines or bounds of slavery. Now, what this will do is it will make slavery, again, far worse than it ever had been before. Now, again, slavery is unfortunately, a human condition that's been around from the beginning. Every nation has had to deal with it until very, very modern history, right? When the West has largely done away with it. And we will too. But in this period of time, as slavery becomes that much more profitable, remember, if your slave was worth $500 and now your slave is worth $1,500, you're super rich. And you're not going to want to part with them, certainly not for free. And that slave's going to have a far more difficult time purchasing their own freedom because their price is much, much higher. All right. But the laws change. The laws get very harsh. So, For example, the laws will limit travel. You'll see this in one of your documentaries with Frederick Douglass. They have to have special permission to travel because the fear is if they do travel, they'll run away. And they didn't really have a good way to recover slaves if they run away. All right. We'll talk later about Harriet Tubman and some others who were trying to help people escape. I mean, those people were symbols of hope. They didn't really save that many people, but people had hope that they could be saved. So they limited travel. It was very difficult. They didn't let slaves assemble because they felt like if they were assembling, then they would have a better chance of plotting, some kind of revenge. There are a very small number of slave revolts. Most of them end up being just some kind of very small random massacre. And then, of course, the wrath comes down on the slaves that participated in it, and things are bad. So you don't see a lot of that. The rules are very, very harsh. Education will be done away with for slaves. An educated slave is a dangerous slave, right? Knowledge is power, and they don't want them to have knowledge, even though a slave would probably be more valuable if they had more knowledge. They were also considered to be more dangerous. So slaves, by and large, are not going to be educated. And so the educated runaway slave, like a Frederick Douglass, is the worst nightmare that slave-owning people had, because he could articulate in writing and in speech exactly what was going on because he had a certain level of education. So Frederick Douglass will be the nemesis of a lot of these people. And so slavery then takes this really negative downturn. There had been people releasing slaves. Slaves were being sent back to Africa, which was kind of a disaster. Keep in mind, most of these slaves were born here. They weren't born in Africa. They had been moved previous generations. So most of the population of slaves, there's about 4 million slaves in 1860, maybe a couple million in the beginning of the 1800s. And most of them were born here and they were adapted here, and they would go back because that would mean freedom. But when they do go back, they suffer disease and hardship, and it's pretty much kind of a dead end. And the number of people that are sent back is a drop in the bucket. So this whole thing is going to get worse. And typically in America, when we're talking slavery, it's this era of slavery, this post-cotton boom, post-American Revolution era of slavery, where things are going to get much worse. And they are already racial, and they're going to get much, much worse. All right? Now, that ends this lecture on commerce. The next lecture, we're going to talk about Old Hickory. We're going to talk about Andrew Jackson as president and get into Jacksonian democracy and some of the changes that take place. So when that lecture happens, you will see me then. For now, goodbye and good luck.